Under the federal welfare reform law taking effect in 1997, power to care for the poor shifts directly to the states. New York's legislature faces some tough decisions as it debates a plan for the state. How will it shape the workfare program? Will job training and child care be provided? What will it do about those without any skills or hope for employment? Where are the jobs to come from in New York State? Here to help us examine these crucial issues are Queens Assemblyman Jeffrion L. Aubrey, who heads the state Black and Puerto Rican Legislative Caucus, and Liz Kruger, Associate Director of the Community Food Resource Center, an anti-poverty advocacy group. Assemblyman, is the legislature prepared to go along with the governor on his 45% cut and some of his other suggestions? How is this going to work as we come into this legislative year?
The governor is going to propose, as is his job. We will then begin a process of debate. You will see undoubtedly the split between the Senate and the Assembly.
What I would love to see the legislature take on this year is addressing the real issues we have to face in this state because of federal welfare reform. There is nothing in the governor's plan that calls for job creation. That's what we have to be talking about. There's nothing in the governor's plan that talks at all about how we move people up and out of poverty. I think that government for too long, both Governor Pataki and the federal government, have gotten the assignment wrong. They keep thinking the assignment is to just cut people off of benefits. The real assignment is to move people out of poverty, and what we need in the state is a serious debate and discussion and plan for how we're going to do that. And of course, the governor's rhetoric doesn't match his own facts, because the State Department of Labor, which is an agency under the rubric auspices of the governor, has recently come out with their analysis for 1997, showing that basically there's a job gap of over 600,000 jobs in New York State. There are over 900,000 people in need of jobs, and only 270,000 jobs available. The math doesn't play out. Right. And so unless we address how we're going to create jobs, use government as a stimulus to provide assistance to ensure that there are jobs and target those to where we need the most in poor communities, we're not going to solve this problem.
Yes. This whole process has been based on some fallacious assumptions and some that we just won't recognize. One is that this is not a full employment economy. The United States, its economic system will not operate if everybody works. There are serious attempts to maintain people not working, I believe, in order so that we hold down inflation, the value of the dollar stays the same. So we then turn around and blame the people who are left out. And this is an attempt, as far as I'm concerned, to pass that blame on those who are least able to defend themselves. Basic things have to be put in place that will protect people. You need to keep a safety net.
One of the interesting things, obviously, is under this new Welfare Reform Act that many municipal workers who are Black and Latino are being displaced. Right. There's already been 21,000 let go in the city of New York, disproportionately Black and Latino. They've already added on about 36 to 40,000 people working off their grant as web workers, with a projection, I think, of 120,000 by next year.
In order to meet the federal requirements.
There are only 350,000 municipal workers in New York. When we're starting to hear numbers like 120, 200,000 web workers, we may be seeing the end of many Black and Latino jobs in poor neighborhoods. Has there been any reaction that you're hearing from the unions in terms of what this is all going to mean? I haven't heard enough, obviously.
I think unions are extremely concerned about what this process is going to mean to their membership in the replacement of their existing workers. The fact is, a lot of unions are trying to negotiate processes in which a web worker will become a city worker after a certain period of time.
African American and Latino and women workforce participation in the fire department is lagging the nation. Our fire department has only 3% Black, Latino, and women and Asian in it, which is ridiculous, worse than any other major city. Isn't this the time now to start raising the question? You can't have it both ways. You can't hammer poor people, who are predominantly minority, and at the same time keep doors shut because of union work rules and other restraints. And I'm wondering if that's the time to start opening it.
I think you do open that battle. I think you go back to residency requirements.
Absolutely, which
because
has been, no one's
made-
talked about
It
it.
makes no sense for us to now put our people in such a position and then not offer them the opportunity to work in the city at the best paying jobs. I mean, that has, since I've been in the legislature, that had been an issue that we've battled. Quite frankly, the suburban, the counties around the city of New York who benefit from this process fight us very hard, and we have not had an administration that's willing to take that on.
In line with the national trend of moving welfare recipients into jobs, New York City 2 years ago began its Work Experience Program, popularly known as WEP. Not everyone has been happy with the experience. I'm David R. Jones, president of the Community Service Society of New York, a social services organization that fights for the rights of poor people. Today we will look at the issue of welfare to work, what its implications are for the greater society, as well as individuals directly affected. We have as our guest David Butler, Assistant Director of the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, MDRC as it's known, a national not-for-profit group that evaluates welfare experiments. What would be the right way for municipalities to do this?
Well, it's a complex question because it depends not only on the characteristics of the people who are on welfare, the nature of the economy in those localities, the nature of the bureaucracy. But we've studied many programs over the years, and we see a number of features that we would that we would say are concomitants of successful initiatives. One thing is that it's very important that if people are participating in education and training, and we think that there should be participation in education and training, that it be very clear that the goal of those programs be employment. Very often education and training has its own reason for being. There's not a lot of focus on moving people from that activity into jobs. And the programs that have been more successful have really made the education and the training link up closely with the labor market through using job developers, through getting teachers who are in the field, through having the training be really work-based, through simulating a work environment in the training and the education world. And that kind of experience does seem to lead to people getting employed.
In the city of New York, Felix Rohatyn and Mr. Kiley have come up with a notion that the city should focus on major infrastructure reconstruction as one of the ways to generate jobs for the welfare poor. In other words, start making WEP assignments or another iteration of WEP something that would come together with capital infrastructure redevelopment. Could that kind of effort work? In other words, could you talk about essentially a New York City-based WPA program that would have long-term impact on the viability of New York?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly the WPA worked. It was the most successful job creation program we've ever had, and it got people employed and taught them real skills. It seems to me that it can work if there's sufficient investment to make it successful, if there's a commitment to make it happen.
If you were sort of the sort of supervisor of all jobs programs across the nation, what would you see as the kind of things, the benchmarks you'd look for in terms of creating a first-class jobs program? What would it look like? Would it be raking leaves? Or would there be job categories at all? What would it be like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, firstly, I would not. I would use some of the things that New York City is doing. I think there is a place for mandatory work in welfare to work programs. I think there's a legitimacy to the notion that there should be some quid pro quo for getting welfare benefits. The problem is whether it's a fair exchange, it seems to me. I mean, what we have now in New York, we have welfare recipients who are really doing the jobs of city employees and yet are getting only a welfare grant in exchange for that. So that takes me in two directions. If you're going to use this model as the base, then either you need to start paying people more for doing this kind of work, or alternatively, you have to think about it in different ways as a training ground to move people off of welfare into unsubsidized employment. And in order to accomplish that, then I think you have to think a little bit differently about the way the WEP program is structured. WEP now is really focused on accomplishing important work that the city needs done. but it's not focused especially on how you can meet the needs of the individual welfare clients and play to their strengths and help develop their skills and build their experience in a way in which they can get a job that's off of welfare. And I think if that structural change took place, and if the program, for example, built in more group activities related to job clubs and job readiness, if it used job developers, if it thought more about getting people into positions in fields where there were likely to be jobs, then I think it would be a better approach.
There are many factors that argue against an easy transition from welfare to work for the 205,000 people the city classifies as employable. Most are without a high school diploma that even the most low-skilled jobs now require. They lack the work experience and job readiness skills that employers most prize. And through no fault of their own, the jobs are not there. New York City has never fully recovered the hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in the 1989 recession. Even today, the unemployment rate is 10.1%. There are 8 job applicants for each opening. We need a dedicated effort by government and private companies and the not-for-profits to create jobs for welfare workers that make a meaningful difference in their lives and ours. A vibrant and thriving commercial environment is an important linchpin for every community, no less for Harlem, which has suffered its ups and downs through the years. Today's Urban Agenda will explore what's ahead for the community which is at the heart of African American culture and history. I'm David R. Jones, President of the Community Service Society of New York. My guest is Deborah C. Wright, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone Development Corporation. Talking from your prior experience as HPD Commissioner, we at CSS and the audience recognize that there are major changes going on in terms of housing subsidies, and this is particularly important, obviously, up in Harlem. With the devolution of HUD and the loss of deep subsidy programs to build new housing, how will there, as you work on the empowerment zone side, are we running up against someone who's pulled the plug on the other side and going to just as seriously destabilize the Harlems and the South Bronxes of the world? How will this all intersect together?
Well, it's a frightening time, actually. I mean, not just housing, obviously, welfare reform, and you think about the impact on local bodegas and grocery stores and other basic staples that depended on food stamps and those kind of expenditures. When you have welfare reform, so to speak, and cut job training by a third at the same time, it doesn't make me feel confident about the prospects. But I think it's very difficult to map out how all of those changes will take place at one time and the net effect on the community. Paradoxically, if we had had 4 or 5 years head start on the empowerment zone and some of those positive initiatives, maybe we wouldn't be as fearful.
How will low-income people find adequate housing in the city of New York against a shrinking available stock? What do you think the best approaches to this should be?
Well, you know, one of the approaches we had was to try to get as many people into homeownership units as possible. And virtually all of the 1 to 4 buildings have been put in a couple programs to do that, some focusing on low-income families, some focusing on working families that are more of a moderate income level. And it's interesting, if you drive through the streets now, you see a lot of those under construction. In fact, 7,000 units were turned out in the last 3 years, and another 6,800 units are planned for the next 24 months. That having been said, as you know, David, as you drive through, the hole that we're in is dramatic. The level of vacancy and city ownership of property continues both vacant as well as occupied. Without Section 8 subsidies, obviously, we looked to tax credits when we were there. And now, as you know, everybody's figured that out, and so tax credits are dear and precious as well. Ultimately, when you look at this crisis, it's going to be very difficult for the city alone to fill this big hole. And that's why it's so distressing to see the federal government really moving out of this business, because it's something that's very difficult for a city administration to carry.
One of the signs, obviously, we on the social welfare side are already seeing, obviously, is the return to welfare hotels, which we thought was sort of an artifact of the past, and obviously people staying overnight in the emergency assistant unit offices. Welcome once again to the Urban Agenda. I'm David R. Jones, President of the Community Service Society of New York, and your host. Today we'll deal with a subject that just won't seem to go away: the mayor's campaign to privatize municipal hospitals. Despite lawsuits by the City Council, unions, and board members of the Health and Hospitals Corporation claiming that privatization would ultimately deprive the poor of proper medical care, the administration clings to its vision of turning over municipal hospitals to profit-making organizations. Here to discuss the issue with me are Diane Lacey-Winley, Associate Pastor of the United Church of Spring Valley and a member of the HHC Board, and Edward Sadowski, attorney for the City Council in its successful suit to stop privatization of Coney Island Hospital. Diane, you and I guess, are among the dissenting board members of HHC who are concerned about privatization. What are your principal concerns?
My major concern is that the city residents have come to expect quality health care from all of our public hospitals. And this plan that is moving so quickly to lease Coney Island Hospital for close to 200 years has so many unanswered questions, questions that, if answered negatively, may deprive residents of the Coney Island community of the full services, full health services that they require and they need. And all of our requests for information to help us adequately answer these questions have really been denied.
Most of us get some kind of health care. We got a private policy, you get Medicare if you get old, and if you're very poor, you get Medicaid. And there is 30 million people in America, a good many of whom live in New York, who've got nothing. And that's where the public hospitals have begun, have taken up the role. They do it.
I think one of the concerns we had, Diane, myself, and Jim Dumpson, the dissident board members at HHC, we couldn't get them even factoring in the issue of welfare reform and its almost immediate impact in increasing the number of uninsured.
The mayor needs to understand that in the public hospital system, the Health and Hospitals Corporation of today, he already has the model that people all over the country are imitating. We have the system with our neighborhood family care centers, our outreach with our tertiary care centers. We already have the system. It just needs to be fine-tuned.
With 25% of its 8 million people at the poverty line, New York City can't afford to close the doors of its public hospitals just yet. Because so few doctors are still practicing in poor neighborhoods, many residents use hospital emergency rooms as their primary care facilities. Last year, public hospitals counted 4.8 million outpatient visits. For the rest of New York City's inhabitants who don't use them, these hospitals provide health insurance. Those same public hospitals control long-term, socially unacceptable diseases like TB and AIDS, and keep the rest of us from being swept away in epidemics. Rich or poor, we need our public hospitals. There are 1.9 million New Yorkers on welfare, and the state wants all of them to enroll in health maintenance organization, HMOs, by the end of the year. That may be a prescription for disaster. Can they make that 1 year? Can they do all this? Can they enroll all those individuals?
They absolutely cannot put in fact, I think what we're talking about is 3 million beneficiaries that they'd like to enroll statewide in 1 year, and there's no way they can do it.
If you would have to, rate the top 3 kinds of problems that people raise with you at your sort of informational meetings, what would they be? From the floor, what would people be most concerned about?
The time span. the time that when they enroll
Right.
to that first visit,
Yeah.
when they go to the emergency room, the type of treatment, or if they're going to be treated
At all.
Right.
at all. That has become a very important issue.
Right.
Or if they're going to stuck with a bill
Yes.
afterwards. They may get treated, but then they
You
get the
know,
bill.
you go to the emergency room, you have a child, the child has asthma,
Right.
and your son is, and they're telling you, oh, you're not in this plan. You need to go 10 blocks away.
Right.
And my cry is, as a workshop leader,
Right.
this is when you lose that quiet tone and you go to the next level.
What we're hoping for is actually a legislative response, and we're working, the task force is working in coalition with other people who are having problems in managed care, i.e. the Medicare beneficiaries,
Right,
the
who are
elderly
next.
people, people who are
Yes,
disabled,
they're-
who are
yes.
also being recruited very heavily,
Right.
and commercially enrolled people like me. My employer gives me a
Yep.
managed care plan. And in coalition with all different kinds of payer groups, if you will, people, different kinds of beneficiaries, we've been fortunate to have Assemblyman Granis and Senator Villela put forward a bill in Albany
Right.
called the Managed Care Client Assistance Program, MACAP. So think McDonald's, think MACAP. And what this does is it will help people enroll, make decisions about what's right for them, which plan's right for them, for those folks that do have choices. Many commercially enrolled people don't. Their employer just gives them one. And once they get in, helps them navigate the system. And that's a really important piece, and we're really hoping that people will come out in support of this bill.
Now, what happens, there's a big welfare reform issue going, and literally we think we may have hundreds of thousands of people who lose their welfare benefits. Will they lose their Medicaid benefits then? And what happens then?
Under the federal law, they should Medicaid's held harmless.
Okay.
But it really depends on what they do in Albany.
Government's rush to enroll Medicaid beneficiaries without first laying the educational groundwork could lead to hardship or even loss of life. Unless individuals understand exactly how to access their health care before a crisis arises, this plan, like others hastily put out by government, will lead to tragedy for families and unwanted newspaper headlines for the bureaucracy. The Community Service Society is doing its share, but its workshops will reach 4,000 individuals, only a fraction of those affected. It's the responsibility of government to see that all Medicaid beneficiaries are educated about this vital issue, and then provide the oversight to make sure the HMOs are delivering their promises. For the 150 years of its existence, education had always been a central concern of my organization because it offers the best way out of poverty. But these days, public education is under siege. It is threatened on all sides by exploding student population, sharply reduced government funding, and initiatives for alternative schools. Has the public turned its back on public education? Is this last best avenue out of poverty being closed off? For the answers to these and other questions, we have turned to William C. Thompson, Jr., President of the New York City Board of Education. Well, Bill, you were born, bred, raised in Brooklyn and in the public schools.
We're Brooklyn guys, David.
Are we doomed here? Is public education going to pack it in?
I don't think so. I think that what you're seeing these days in New York City is almost a resurgence in support for public education. I think if you look at the business community, if you look at government, whether it's the president, whether it is the governor, whether it's the mayor, everyone's talking about education and public education and increasing standards. When you start to look and you look at some of the poll numbers in the last election for president, and you saw that crime might have been a major issue, but in some polls, education outpolled crime as the #1 issue with the public. So I think education and public education are in the forefront still.
But are the public and the politicians willing to put their money where their mouths are?
I think that what people are looking for, and the politicians across the country, what people are saying is, yeah, we'd like to give money to public education, and you've seen instances where there is additional dollars being funneled to education this year on the city level and the state level. The federal government's talking about new initiatives, but people want to see results also. For over a period of years, money has gone to public education, at least in the 80s, increasing amounts. with declining results. I think people are looking to hold those of us in the education field hold us accountable for the money that we get.
Now, in getting accountable, I think one of the things we're concerned about from the Community Service Society, obviously, is when we did a little monograph looking at where qualified teaching resources were. We had real difficulty finding certified math and science teachers, for instance, in Brownsville and the South Bronx. Can we really ask for, you know, significant improvement in outcomes if we have teachers teaching math and science, for instance, who couldn't pass the tests that are the basic requirements for the kid?
No, I'd agree with you. I think that as far as it goes, and even though there are, and I've been to a number of schools in Bed-Stuy, in Brownsville, and you speak to principals, and they will tell you at certain points that some of their best teachers are those who have not, in fact, received their certification. Some of them who have not passed those tests. However, I think it's important. One of the things that we have to do is a better job in training teachers, in teachers who are with us. We've got to get control of professional development.
Now, the public and conservative commentators, everyone is talking about we should basically privatize the whole system. There are charter schools and religiously based schools, and I guess the mayor, I'd like to hear of the status of the mayor's plan for Catholic school education with our troubled students. How do we approach this? What is your view as president of the board about as these arguments come up?
Okay, I think that we are at an important, and when I talk about enthusiasm in the city of New York for public education these days, I'm talking about federal, state, city. I think that people look, and New York City is occupies an important place in the public education discussion nationwide. I think that what we're looking at right now is if we don't succeed now with public education in New York, then other things are going to pop up. Other things will come into play. So whether it's vouchers, whether it is privatization, as a couple of municipalities around this country have done.
There's been a sort of an ongoing struggle that the state funding formula discriminates against New York City. Where does that stand in terms of your effort? And explain what the discriminatory impact of the state.
We have about close to 38% of the students in the state. We've only received a little more than 34% of the funding. That's inequitable. That's not fair. That's not right.
One of the things the public throughout the city, all races and class, are concerned about is safety in the schools. How is the board and the chancellor approaching that? I know the mayor, there was a dispute of sorts as to whether police should do in-school security. I think Rudy Crew and the board was somewhat adamant that no, that wasn't appropriate. Where do we stand on that?
What we have said is all along that the Office of School Safety, our school safety officers, the chancellor has to maintain control of that.
Public schools in New York City are in deep trouble. They are starved for resources. Students need to get a first-rate education, something that generations of earlier residents took for granted. But it's not too late to turn the system around. It will require real dedication and cooperation on the part of politicians, educators, parents, and the public at large. But the city's public education system can be made to work again. This is David R. Jones saying goodbye for the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.